Hi, this is Dan, and welcome to another episode of Backward Engineering Your Career. And the reason I'm calling this Backward Engineering Your Career is because we're going to look at a different tack today. Rather than focusing exclusively on fictional screenwriting and the big blingy streaming world of premium content creation, we're going to focus a little bit on that and a little bit on traditional network and basic cable material, but also very, very deeply on the world of independent content creation, such as can be seen with YouTube and Instagram and TikTok and Twitch and all of those other services. Because in all honesty, that is where approximately 80% of all new content is generated. And that's where most of your viewership is. Now, I know that we're often hearing many different stories about what's going on where and why traditional network, linear TV, basic cable are no longer relevant. But let's be real. The truth is that those individual markets are actually highly revenue generative. You still have most of the money that is done in the upfronts, that period of time once a year when networks receive ad agency bids for how much they are planning to buy in terms of commercials. That is still largely devoted to network and basic cable, with the streaming services, the premium streaming services, taking what is right now a distant second. I'm not going to say that's not going to change in the near future, but for now, it is still very heavily tilted toward the legacy media. Yeah, it's not sexy. Yeah, it's not cool, but at the same time, it's cost protected. It's also very, very revenue driven and still accounts for a lot of the overall profit picture of the studios. The first thing we're going to discuss is, what medium do you think you are going to be most comfortable with? It might not be where you end up, but it is always important to at least know what your options are and where you feel your talent lies. And this is important because each version of the media has its own particular things about it that make it unique from the other forms of media. This all came about almost 60 years ago when Marshall Mcluhan wrote a book that analyzed the entire world of media and the entire world of how media is not only created but consumed. In that book, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, Mcluhan came up with what initially sounded like a preposterous thesis, and that was that the medium was the message. Now, what does the medium is the message is? Well, as a simplification, what Mcluhan felt was that what form of medium you were writing your project for was going to determine not only its form, but its content. And in fact, the type of media that you chose was going to be an important part of what that message ultimately was. That your story was, in a sense, an enhancement of whatever that medium was. So let's start with books, such as Mcluhan's book. The beauty of a book is that it has a lot of detail. And within that detail, you can get into nuance. You can get into all sorts of resolution of what seem to be disparate pieces of information. You have the luxury of going into a deep dive. And in the process of going into that deep dive, you can be very informed as well as your readers. So that's a huge thing. But there's a disadvantage in books, and that is books are very seldom done quickly. Now, when I was growing up in the 70s and you had the Watergate hearings happen, you would have what were then called instant books. And these were books that would do things like do transcriptions of trial testimony. And these were done very quickly. But then again, they still had an incredible amount of detail because they would have the actual transcripts of the Watergate hearings. So you could get all of that detail and thereby use it to make up your own opinion. The next step down the line is the traditional magazine, and whether this is online or whether it is a physical media. And we all know that by and large, the physical world of magazines is pretty extinct. And as it is, the age break for traditional news magazines is really half the audience is 70 and over, and the other half is younger. So this is on its way to becoming an irrelevance. And I think this is sad because the beauty of a magazine article is it has a little bit more time proximity to the initial story. Because usually with a magazine, you have about a week in order to go through the elements of the story. During that week, the elements of the story might change and you have more information. So therefore, it's a lot more reliable than the world of things like YouTube videos or instant headlines or even a daily newspaper type story. There is time to have a little bit of perspective. And therefore, those stories are still long, but nowhere near as long as a book. But you still have a lot of detail and therefore the ability to come up with a solid sense of perspective. Now, the next down the line in terms of accuracy is going to be the daily newspaper. And it's a pity that most daily newspapers are no longer in the physical form because there was something very tactile and appropriate about having a physical newspaper. And in fact, when we look back at the history of news media, the reason that daily newspapers were so effective was that you had an opportunity to see, even if you didn't take it all in, that there was more than one opinion, and that opinions were something that were very changeable. For example, let's say you lived in a big city and you had multiple regional newspapers. I think at one time, New York had 33 regional papers that would be out in the city. So let's say you were getting off the sidewalk and you were walking down the street. You would see different headlines all being associated with the same picture. And you might choose only the New York Times or whatever, the Herald, but you would see that there were other kinds of opinions. And even if you didn't believe them, even if you felt that those were propaganda, you would still have that sense that there are other ideas out there, and maybe I might just read one of these, if only for confirmation bias that it was full of you know what. So you had an ability to have that sense that there were other opinions. You also had articles that were fairly comprehensive in their depth, considering that if it's breaking news, you had to know that at least 50% or more, I'm going to say it was actually 90% or more, of the initial reporting was probably going to be, to a greater or lesser extent, wrong, but it had immediacy. So you knew something big had happened. As we go further down, we're going to start getting into an area where the news source becomes increasingly less reliable. And you have to be aware of that as you're looking toward the next things we're talking about, that the truth element becomes increasingly secondary to the ability to generate clicks, to generate purchases, to generate anger, to generate ratings. The first of these is something that is largely part of legacy media. And this time, let's focus on radio, and that is talk radio. Now, talk radio, whether it be NPR or any of the local the local information jocks, have 3 hours usually to do their program. And a lot of times it's very strongly based on their personality, good, bad, or indifferent. And it's always going to be controversial, but these radio shows have their peak during drive time hours where people are a captive audience, whether they're stuck on a train, whether they are listening in their cars. Now, we all know that that has changed very dramatically in the age of the internet and streaming media. That doesn't mean it's gone. You still have an incredible amount of revenue going to news channels and to the and to talk radio. And yes, it's very politicized, but it leads with that. So if you're listening to a radio commentator, you know that if you listen to NPR, it's more likely than not to skew left. And if you're listening to commercial talk radio, it's more likely than not to skew right, because that's just where the advertising dollars and the audiences are found. Now, most of talk radio is also fairly old skewing. So they tend to have a much wider diversity on what they talk about because they're talking to people whose median age is probably somewhere between 60 and 70. And it's pretty much always been this way. Young people don't listen to radio to find out what's going on in the world. And the older you are, the more likely you are to pay attention to it. Nonetheless, because you have an incredible amount of time for discussion, you can have at least a side of an argument or a situation presented with a great deal of detail. Everything we are going to be talking about below this is going to be somewhat suspect. The first of these is television news. For many years, television news was dominated by male anchormen who would present what was going on in the world in what seemed to be an unbiased means. Now, the truth was they were biased, but they were constrained by time. If you think of the regular news reports, especially in the days when Walter Cronkite or Huntley and Brinkley or Hugh Downs was running the commentary, the truth was you didn't have time to go into detail on many of the stories. And you had a lot of video footage that would cover it, or 16 millimeter silent footage in many instances. So you didn't really go into a lot of depth. So what you were getting is you were getting a headline view of the world, just like 24-hour news channels on radio often present. Give us 22 minutes and we'll give you the world, which would include traffic reports and weather. So you're only giving a top line. You're only giving the base. You're only giving what is in effect a news version of a trailer. When Walter Cronkite was trusted by most of the public, his television news broadcast was approximately 15 minutes, with the back 15 minutes being local news coverage that later expanded to half an hour and half an hour. Today, most of our local news is considered a form of cheap programming, and it can run as much as 3 hours, including the network feed. So during that 3 hours, you now have time for a lot of local news. You also have a lot of time for junk news. The minus of television reporting is that it is so based on strong visuals that you can't really trust it. What do I mean by that? I mean, a car chase is immediately dramatic and will grab your attention. So that is why on broadcast television, often if there's a great car chase going on, you will cut to that car chase from all regular programming. even though it's not important. It's great video. And you had certain stations, and this was way back in the 80s, starting to say, we're not going to cut away from our regular programming to cover car chases and the like. That time, we also had a lot of sensational trials that were going on, whether it be OJ, whether it be the Menendez brothers, or whatever. And what they found was they were now going to be counter-programming because the majority of the audience was going to be watching that sensational footage instead. So for all intents and purposes, that footage has led. If you think of most news stories right now, what drives the top news story? It's a good piece of video. So therefore, important things that are going on worldwide will be ignored. And why are they ignored? Because you have better footage coming in from a dog that was kidnapped from its owner's yard. So you have a skewed view of the reality of the world, and worse, a lot of times television news is almost a proctologist view of the world. All you're seeing is the negative story, so it can give you a very depressive view. Nonetheless, because television news is relatively short, outside of the local news, you're still being teased to look to another source for more in-depth. Now we come to perhaps some of the more dangerous ones, and that is the 24-hour news channel. I know that there's a lot of people who pick MSNBC, CNN, or Fox as their main source, and they look at whatever the other two are as being fake news. The truth is, all of it is fake news. All of it is on the level of an afternoon talk show, because it's not about really giving forth information. It's about delivering advertisers. The 24-hour news channels skew extraordinarily old, almost as old as the newspapers and magazines. The median age for MSNBC, which is the youngest skewing of the three 24-hour news channels, is 65 years old. It's nothing but a bunch of older people watching it, really, on a regular basis. The next youngest is CNN, where the median age is 67. Fox News is the oldest, and its median age is 68, which is down from before. Its previous median age was 70, so it's come down 2 years. It's still old as you know what. And you can tell that by the news coverage. Look at where the framework for most of the stories are. They will begin at the mostly with an assumption that every viewer is at least aware of 9/11, and some of them will go back to the Clinton administration. And on certain rare occasions, they might go as far back as the Reagan administration, or at least the last years. They know that it is unlikely that someone who did not live through those periods will be watching their network. How do we know that this is all set up? Well, the way we know it's all set up is that the advertisers are common across all three networks. They are just delivering a slightly different audience segment. What else is covered in the advertising? Mostly drugs and other medications. That tells you everything. That tells you why only certain stories are covered in terms of big pharma or big health or any of that, because that is their chief advertiser. There is no difference between any of the 24-hour news channels. And I don't care if you have a bias. They're all the same. All of them are geared towards drama. Whenever you have a panel, and it doesn't matter which of those networks are, you'll usually have 4 people against 1. And that one is going to be made to look like they're in confrontation. But what's the truth? After the show's over, and no matter how dramatic they were during the course of their conversation, they're going to go out to the same $200 plus per person dinner and be high-fiving each other. These are all rich people. They agree with each other. They agree that they like money. They're going to pretend like they're not. Trust me, if you're making $15 million a year, you're not really going to have an adversarial relationship with other people who make $15 million a year, except in order to make it look good. That's why that medium in the message is, I believe, the worst. Now, let's go into new tech. And that is the world of gonzo journalism. And gonzo journalism is represented by a lot of the YouTubers who started out merely pointing a camera at themselves and talking and giving their opinion. Just like the talk radio stations, they have the benefit in many instances of going on for a very, very long time and getting into detail. But there are some significant caveats to the YouTube verse or the independent content creation verse. I happen to love this type of journalism because I feel it throws us back to the old days of the newspapers, in that by just looking at the thousands and thousands, millions of YouTube channels that there are out there, you are aware all the time that no matter who you're watching, that there's a world of other opinions out there which might be right and which might be wrong. So it does remind you that there is more than one perspective, and that's a good part. You also have certain people, because of the way they behave within the world, putting themselves in risky situations, sometimes too risky, being opinionated, getting people to come on, that they're going to have a bias. And most YouTube channels lead with their bias, which means, Kevin Mtor, you have a disclosure up front. So that's a positive. Where the YouTube verse has got into trouble is AdSense and the advertising dollar, because what's happened with that is you've allowed a lot of people to start gearing their content toward their audience in the same way that a cable 24-hour news channel does. So sometimes you can get the sense that they're doing their coverage for likes and clicks as opposed to integrity. And it doesn't matter what they say. It matters that you come up with that. And so again, you have to be willing to be discerning and look at each one and say, how many embedded advertisers do they have? How much can I trust them based on that? Same as network. And you still have that if it bleeds, it leads. That if it's something that has arresting footage, you might have a little bit of a challenge. The final is social media in general. And I would say that this is where social media is actually dangerous, whether it be X/Twitter, whether it be Facebook, whether it be Instagram, no matter what it is. A lot of this is very present. It's very based on nothing but a snapshot. And most importantly, it is based on creating anger, because anger keeps people involved. A happy ending means the person feels satisfied and can turn away. A fight in the personal arena, where you get a dopamine hit by supposedly beating the trolls or whatever, is almost a high. And you have a lot of people who will then invade a space and just to be contentious. So you have tons of hysteria and misinformation and lies being perpetrated. And there is no real cover for that. And people go, well, shouldn't too much free speech is a bad thing? No, it isn't. Too much free speech is a good thing because it lets you be aware that there's a lot of other people. The danger is when that gets weaponized and people start losing their jobs and or making threats. This is not a good side of this. So please be careful with social media. Yes, social media is fun. Social media can drive you into going to other areas, but for the purposes of what we're going to be talking about in the future, I'm not going to tell you how to get more followers on TikTok or X or any of that. Now, let's talk about another area. When I was talking about fictional screenplays, we always broke our and I was in development. We always broke our type of creative into people who were story based, who were character based, or who were scene based. And as a writer, you tend to fall into one of those three categories where you have an extra strength, and you'll often mix the two. The same goes true for independent content creation, for basic cable, for network, for streaming premium documentaries, feature films as well. You usually are strong in one of three areas. The first of those three areas is to be strong in event capturing. This is when you go out there and you try to capture the drama of a given event, whether that be a political rally, whether that be something going on in your neighborhood, whether it be a debate between two important people. You are covering a standalone event, and your job is to focus on the details on it, focus on the people that are impacted by it, focus on the real meat and potatoes of what is happening. The second type is personality based, and that's when you are more likely to be doing a documentary or being part of some sort of historical series where you're focused on the people, you're focused on their biography, you're focused on why they are who they are, you're focused on some event that they're in right now and how their particular part of it is key or highly important. The final type is theme orientation. This is when you approach every story or character that you're covering by some other agenda. Maybe you're someone who believes in some form of activism. Well, you're going to cover events, you're going to cover personalities that reinforce your perspective, and you'll be a lot more you'll be a lot more open about being either event or personality focused, but you're going to probably do something with the same general theme throughout. So, what I would like to do in the future is focus on some of the things that really lead to a career in this unscripted world. Yes, we will talk a little bit about game shows. Yes, we will talk a little bit about reality shows, which are manipulations of reality, let's just put it that way, but are done for an entertainment business as well. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it. How do you feel?
We're mad now, and we're not going to take this anymore.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Network News Hour with Sybil the Soothsayer. Miss Matahari and her skeletons in the closets. And starring the mad prophet of the airways, Howard Beale.